white guy floating on the right. This is the first time in nearly 5 years that I've ever seen a Hodza Hunter-Gatherer in the water. They do not swim. These are younger Hadza, boys, they're less than 10 years of age. So this was pretty dramatic for me to see this, and we're going to touch on this at the end. And I'm also using this as a metaphor for what's going on in the Western world. And we lost the ability to click and move, so Trey's going to be my clicker mover. So real quickly, we're not going to do a big overview of the gut microbiome.
Can you use the mic just so that they're recording, so that more people can see your program? I'm just afraid that the sound will...
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not going to do a big overview of the gut microbiome. I'm guessing that this crowd probably either reads the newspaper, a magazine, or watches television and knows that the gut microbiome, the genes and the microbes that carry in our body, are actually the new black. They're everywhere. You can't pick up anything without reading about the gut microbiome. So we're going to skip all what a gut microbiome is, how many trillions of cells we have in our body, and we're just going to move along to what I think might be some more interesting stuff. So this is an interesting photograph. This was taken by this is a Justin Sonnenberg lab at Stanford University. And basically what these little guys here are, these are microbes, and they've all been colored. And this is the mucosa barrier, this green area, and then those are the cells on the other side. So that green mucosa barrier protects basically the human cells from these microbiota in your colon, and of course in your small intestine as well. So what happens is, if this mucin layer, which is also present in the vagina and in your nostrils, if it in any way degrades or disappears, you now have contact with those microbes and the human cells, and that's where the wheels come off the wagon. And that's basically what we're dealing with in 2018, pretty much in the Western world. So again, keep an eye on this. We're going to talk about it a little bit more at the end. Maintaining that mucosa barrier is everything. Okay, next. We're going to talk about poop. This is my best wildlife photography. I caught this shot in the Serengeti last year. Very exciting for somebody who studies poop to catch this in action. Next. So again, I've spent the last 10 years working in Africa. We started off in Botswana and Namibia. We did some work with the famous San Bushmen, the Gods Must Be Crazy guys. Unfortunately, they've all been sequestered on reservations in Botswana and Namibia and have been told they can't hunt and gather anymore. There is a small enclave in a place called the Nai Conservancy in Namibia that can still hunt, but pretty much everybody's on the government dole. So we moved our project north a couple of thousand miles to Tanzania, where the Hodza Hunter-Gatherers still live today. Next. So what people know about the Hadza, for the most part, is they're hunters and gatherers. And so here you have a couple of 3 men carrying their bows. They get up every morning, they hunt wild game, the women dig tubers. Next, please. So again, anybody that's not familiar with that part of the world, we're talking about this area right in here. The Hadza live along an area that's kind of the central Rift Valley. This is Lake Eyasi in the distance. It's about 100 kilometers long. If you squint and look in the distance, that's the Ngorongoro crater, and just over the cliff from that is Olduvai Gorge. So this gentleman is literally walking on the bones of Homo erectus, Zinjanthropus boisei, Australopithecines, on and on and on. Next. Again, I stole that photo from National Geographic. I thought it was cool. You guys can see over here. Okay. So again, we're going to move along quickly because I know it's late in the day. So these are some Hadza Hunter-Gatherers. This is a camp we call Python Camp. I don't have this photo, but there's a bunch of python skins hanging in the tree. Terrifies the crap out of tourists. So again, traditional grass huts, men sitting around, women doing the work. Next, please. Again, just another shot. The Hadza are highly mobile. They move camps several times a year based on the season, based on the resource base. Again, just some basic shots here. Just going to set up some context. Next, please. Again, Hadza Hunter here. They make all the bows from scratch. The bow strings are made with giraffe tendons if it's available. Here they have 3 vervet monkeys. They eat a lot of them and they're tasty. Next, please. Again, hunter-gatherers. Next. The Hadza hunt and kill about 40 to 50 species of mammals. They drop zebra, kudu, giraffe, warthog. You see it on National Geographic or BBC, they take it down. The only thing they don't kill is elephant. They're terrified of elephants. If they see an elephant coming, they'll run for a day. Terrified of elephants. They tramp the villages and kill people. The Hadza also can name about 700 species of birds. It's absolutely extraordinary. They hunt and kill every one of them. Probably the #1 game animal taken is birds. Next, please. Again, moving along quickly. Something also that's interesting about the Hodza Hunter-Gatherers, there's approximately 1,200 of them left. They're one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer groups in all of Africa. There's some Effie pygmies in the DRC that are still around, but they've been highly acculturated and have kind of moved on, if you will. But there's still a few that live in remote areas. But one thing that characterizes the Hadza's day, men get up in the morning and they go hunting. They typically hunt by themselves. They spend all day. They come back, usually in the afternoon. We'll go back out in the evening. But one constant in their life, this happens to be porcupine. I was here for this kill. Highly recommend porcupine. It's very tasty. Maybe the best meat I've ever had in Africa. But they're eat-as-you-go hunter-gatherers. They never pass up a bush with berries on it. So these are Congolabee berries. So these are super high fiber, and we're going to talk a lot about fiber, super high fiber, and they have sugar in them as well. But they never stop. Even after getting 30, 40 kilograms of meat, they always stop and eat more fiber. It's a constant from the minute they get up to the minute they go to bed at night. Next, please. If you're a Hadza, you love honey, okay? Honey is everywhere in Hadza land. If anybody's familiar with the baobab tree, the tree of life, the Hadza work with honeybirds to find the honey, but they typically know where most of them are. They'll drive pegs in the tree. They'll climb up. The gentleman on the right is carrying a fire stick up. They'll put out the fire, put the smoke in there, shocks the bees. The bees gorge on honey. They take off. Hadza take honey. So all those little nicks on the tree are previous places where they drove pegs this long into the tree to climb up like a ladder. So this particular tree has been used for a long time. You'll see some of these tree pegs that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. Again, the bark's really soft so they can drive them in. It's also very dangerous. This is a killer of old men climbing up in trees. They never stop gathering honey into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Occasionally they lose their footing and there they go. Next, please. They eat every part of the honeycomb. So this is the most energy-dense food in nature. It's honey and fat from the larvae. So they eat the entire thing. The wax gets spit out, but they consume a lot of it. I spend a lot of time climbing up and down in trees. I don't like being stung. It doesn't seem to bother them very much. I've seen men pick as much as 100 or 200 little bee barbs out of their arms, necks, face, legs, lips, eyelids, you name it. If you ask a Hadza hunter-gatherer what their favorite food is, 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you honey or baboon brains. Next. Women, again, women don't hunt. Some women will hunt small game. Boys as little as 6 to 9 years of age will start hunting. They mainly kill birds. They're not strong enough to pull the bow back to kill large mammals. The women get up literally every single morning of every day, of every month, or of every week, I messed that up. They get up every day and they dig tubers. So the ground there is very hard. Women will dig tubers into their 70s, 80s. I have one woman who's 87 years old. She's out there digging tubers. They dig up several species of tubers, and as you can imagine, they're very fibrous, and they collect about 4 or 5 different species. They do this first thing in the morning. They're provisioning resources mainly for children. Men are out hunting, and typically what men will do is they'll go out if they kill a small animal, like a hyrax or something, they'll actually cook it on the spot and eat it. They get home, tells the wife they didn't find anything. There's a lot of that going on. And they get home, it's like, we couldn't find any honey either, and they're just licking their fingers. So women are responsible for rearing the children, little boys and little girls. They leave the weanlings, or they leave the young ones in camp, and they take the ones that are still breastfeeding with them. They carry them on their back, and this happens every day of every week, of every month, of every year. Next, please. Here's some Hadza women. They've dug up some tubers. They place them on the fire. They lightly cook them. It helps them peel the bark away, and they'll just simply chew on it. The tubers are high in carbohydrates and an extraordinary source of dietary fiber. Next. The Hadza, depending on the season, East Africa is characterized by a wet season and a dry season, which we're going to talk about in a minute. 6 months on, 6 months off. When it's raining, you have flowers, you have bees, you have honey. When it's not raining, you have very little honey. When it's raining, you have an extraordinary diversity of sugar-rich berries that are also super high in fiber. These are 2 very common berries, and again, as you can imagine, they're just pure sugar. Next. The other primary food is baobab, again, that tree of life where we see all those see all those bees. These are the fruits that fall from the tree. You can shake them. You remember when we were kids and you had the big chalk, that big chalk that you write on the chalkboard with? That's what the inside of these things look like. Super high in fiber. high in calcium, lots of other vitamins and minerals, and they have a real fatty seed on the inside. Every single day a Hadza will eat baobab. It's also the primary weaning food. So the primary weaning food is high in fat and high in fiber. Next. This is a close-up, and I want you to look. This is an example of the fat. You see the little inside of these seeds. So what they'll do is they'll pound it with a rock, and they'll grind it, and then they winnow it out, and they can isolate the non-edible parts of the seed, and they add water to it and a little bit of honey, and they drink it as a porridge. You see kids drinking it non-stop all day long. Men, when they're out hunting, you'll see baobab fruit laying on the ground. They compete with baboons for the fruit, but you can walk in any direction from a Hadza camp 100 feet, and you'll find a baobab tree with fruit in it. They fruit 11 to 11 and a half months out of the year, and they fruit at different times, so there's always a constant supply of fiber. Next, please. This photo at the top was taken approximately 80 years ago. The one down below was taken last year. And the reason I'm showing this, we're going to touch on this at the end, is I want you to look at the bellies of the children. This is not malnutrition. It was initially interpreted as malnutrition by explorers and researchers 80 to 100 years ago, but this is fermentation. Okay? These kids are eating 50 to 200 grams of dietary fiber a day. So lots and lots of fermentation, lots of flatulence. And again, there's no difference between the kids above and the kids below. There is no shortage of food in Hadza land. There's food everywhere. Next, please. The only thing that the Hadza don't hunt anymore, some megafauna, of course, is not around anymore, or some large mammals, I'm sorry. This is a rhino rib. Don't get this down at the barbecue joint. Anyway, this is a Hadza woman going after it. The rhinos, of course, have disappeared from Hadza land. They're no longer there. There's very few elephants there anymore, but there's lions running around. The Hadza hunt and kill lions, too, by the way. So there are some species that have been lost, and, of course, women do eat meat when the men show up with it. Next, please. Hadza smoke an amazing amount of marijuana, I'm told, and it's pretty good, I'm told. They do it all day long. And so what men will often do is they'll go out and acquire a bunch of honey, they put it in a bucket, and off to town they go. It could be a 5-hour walk or a 2-day walk. They trade the honey for weed. They trade meat for weed, what they're not allowed to do. But they pretty much focus on it all day long. And when I'm in the field with these guys, it's always marijuana, 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 and give me some minutes for my cell phone. A lot of Hadza have cell phones, but they don't have any minutes for their cell phones. Okay, next. Okay, so what we're doing there is we spent the last couple of years in East Africa working with the Hadza with their consent. What we were interested in initially, our research group is made up with researchers from NYU, UCSD, Stanford, some Yahoos in Canada, some Europeans, and of course African researchers as well. What we were interested in is here's a population that is still intimately connected to nature, that has limited access to antibiotics and modern medicines. The babies are still born in the dirt. The babies are still breastfed. They have limited access to tourism. But of those 1,200 Hadza that are still around, if this screen is Hadza land and it's a couple 100 kilometers across, some of the Hadza are heavily exposed to tourists. So that means they have a cash economy. And then there's about 150 Hadza that still get 90 to 95% of all their calories from hunting and gathering. So it changes throughout the year, but sometimes they'll go weeks or months with only hunted and gathered resources. Sometimes they'll get their hands on a couple kilograms of corn, maize if you will, and they'll sit down and they'll eat that for a couple days till it's gone. So we were interested in what the microbes look like on a population that is not westernized, that hasn't run gut first into globalization, that has minimal access to antibiotics and other medicines, but has access and exposure to the microbes on the landscape. So we started off this project, I think, back in 2013. We collect, of course, oral samples from everybody that we can. We've sampled, I think, to date about 400 different Hadza. Next, please. We're interested in their skin microbiota. You know, we're interested, you touch your head a couple of hundred to a couple thousand times a day, depending on how nervous you are and how much coffee you drank. And that's a place where you accumulate a lot of microbes from your body. We sample groins, we sample underneath armpits, we sample left and right hand, back of neck, bottom of foot. The list goes on and on. Next, please. And of course, we collect fecal samples as well. We also collect breast milk from breastfeeding mothers. We also collect skin samples from the breast as well. So we're interested in the contribution of the skin to the suckling baby as well, which of course in the West, a lot of women will clean their breasts before breastfeeding, which is interesting. My ex-wife did that. I still don't know why we did it, but at the time I wasn't in this particular area. So another thing that we do which we're really lucky because the Hadza are allowed by the government to hunt and kill anything they want except for giraffe and lions, and of course they ignore that. And of course they're not allowed to hunt elephant, but they're scared of them. But because they kill so many animals, we're able to sample the animals as well, which is very, very lucky. So if you're a researcher and you're interested in the microbiome or the bacteria in a zebra, you got to go to a zoo. And of course, if they're in a zoo, they're compromised. So consequently, because they kill so many animals, we've been hanging out with them, we now have the largest data set of wildlife in the world. And then because we're able to sample all of these animals, we've got an opportunity to try to understand where the microbes that the Hadza have in their bodies, where they come from, what's the contribution of the animals. We also, when we go out collecting berries with them, we'll sample the berries, we'll sample the leaves. When they dig the tubers, we sample the tubers, we sample the soil, we sample everything. I think we've collected a little over 10 or 11,000 samples to date now. It's the largest microbiome project in the world, aside from the American Gut Project. So it's the largest in-field project in the world. And I've done most of it like this. Next, please. When I'm in Hadza land, the first time I went there, I, of course, sample myself before I get there, while I'm there. So if, the first time I ever went to Hadza land, I have my own camp. I'm set up. I'm eating spaghetti, eating Cheerios, drinking whiskey, occasionally smoking a cigarette or whatever it may be. But one of the things I do is, this is my legs on the right, I'm interested in how my skin microbiome changes by being in Hadza land. I also drink Hadza water. That's baboon shit floating over there to the left. So I go a little hunter-gatherer for a while and done some other kind of crazy stuff as well. Never, ever, ever gotten sick in Hadza land, and I don't know why. I have journalists that come out and visit us all the time. They always get sick. Film crews come out. They always get sick. I'm not sure why I've never gotten sick. But anyway, so one of the things I'm interested in is how my microbiome changes. This experiment with just one individual, but it's interesting to see what happens, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Next, please. The project, again, is full of a lot of smart people. This is Maria Gloria Dominguez Bello on the left. She's now at Rutgers University. She's the world's leading authority on vaginal microbiomes in babies. That's Rob Knight in the middle. Rob Knight, possibly the smartest bioinformatics person in the world. And that's Sam Smits on the right. He was a graduate student at Stanford. I'm not sure what he's doing now. I think he got a real job. And then, of course, that's me trying to figure out what they're doing. So this project includes some of the some of the brightest people in the world, and that was, it took a couple years to put those people together because the data set is so interesting. If some idiot will go collect the samples, it's then easy to get really smart people to then analyze those samples. So we have an extraordinary team of about 27 different researchers from 11 different universities from around the planet working on the project and the samples, and this project will go on for the next 10 or 15 years. We're also biobanking samples, so if I take a stool sample, this is a great story real quick, I told you we were going to get out of here early. Maybe not. The first time I went in the field, we have these little bitty cryo tubes. They're like the size of your finger that have these little caps on them. You unscrew the cap and you put the feces in there. You screw the cap back on and we drop it in liquid nitrogen. So here I am in the field trying to explain to these guys what I need. Shit is called Mavi in Swahili, and in Hadzabe it's called Hichi. So they call me Dr. Mavi. They dropped the doctor, now they just call me Shit, which is Mavi. So like, oh, shit's here, and they don't mean anything by it, but it's just, it's to the point. Anyway, the first time I gave it, so I'm sitting on the ground, have a bunch of people around me. One of the things that we have to do is explain the project. We need informed consent from everybody. We get a thumbprint. They don't know what it's all about, but it's a thumbprint that I've explained to them what we're doing. They think it's very humorous. Only one or two Hadza, to my knowledge, have ever not participated that we've asked to participate. I take some bottled water, I pull it in the dirt, I make a turd, I show them how to get it in the thing. I gave this guy a tube and I said, he went off in the bush and he came back 5 minutes later and he's holding the tube in his hand like this and it's got shit all over it. He just did this and he didn't get the concept of taking the, you got to take the Q-tip, put it in the poo, put it in there. Anyway, so he got a do-over and I have a photograph of it. I wish I could find it. Anyway, so next please. So anyway. Working in East Africa is very hard. The first time I was there for 90 days. The first 30 days we had 50 flats. 50 flats on a really crappy Land Cruiser. But first trip there, it took me 30 days to see my first Hadza. Now I can arrive in Africa and I'm in the field in a day and a half. So it's very hard to work there. It's very hard to get liquid nitrogen in the field. It's very hard not to get in fights in the mountains with the locals who always want to beat up the white guy. It's very difficult to deal with the government, but there's some exceptional people there at the National Institute of Medical Research that we work with. It's just a hard place to work. There was a researcher that went to Hadza land before. Now, Hadza have been studied continuously for the last 100 years. There are researchers in the field right now with the Hadza. It's basically anthropologists. They're interested in different questions than we are. So the Hadza are not uncontacted. They're heavily impacted by tourism and researchers. But again, there's a small group of them that still practice full-time hunting and gathering the vast majority of the time. And so there was a researcher that was in the field about they beat me to the field. It was a microbiome project. They were in the field for 6 weeks, and they collected 28 samples. And so we've collected over 10,000. So it's very, very hard to do what we do, and that's why nobody wants to do it. So one of our original research questions was, East Africa is characterized by wet season, dry season. So we had a simple question. Does the seasonality of East Africa, and the reason East Africa is interesting is, if you believe in evolution, and if you believe that the Hadza are some kind of referent or potential referent for how human populations may have lived at some point, East Africa is interesting because if we migrated through Australopithecines up through Homo erectus and everything else, then the Hadza still hunt and gather the same animals and plants that humans have for millions of years, minus the megafauna. So they also are exposed to the same microbes. So if you're interested in the immune system and how it responds in autoimmune disease, then the human microbe tango that took place in East Africa is potentially interesting. Now, if you want to go to South America and study the Yanomamo or other groups, that's great too, but humans have only been in South America 10, 15,000 years, plus or minus. So our immune system, while it is still evolving, the big chunk of it evolved in East Africa on those plants, those animals, and exposed to those microbes. So the Hadza are desperately interesting because of that. Now, some Hadza have cell phones. I don't care, because they're sitting in the dirt while they're trying to get it to work. Some Hadza have steel knives. I don't care. They're still exposed to the same blood, urine, and feces of the animals. They still pluck the same berries from the same bushes. Some of the Hadza have shorts, LA Laker t-shirts. I don't care. They're still intimately connected to the landscape. Now, if you're an anthropologist, that screws up some of your research. But if you're interested in microbes and the immune system, not so much. So we were interested, did seasonality affect the microbiome of the Hadza? After about 4 years of collecting samples, we collect in dry season, wet season, multiple times, and then we have to do a complete cycle. Turns out the Hadza microbiome changes throughout the year, whereas the microbiome in this room, of every individual in this room, pretty much stays the same. You can get blueberries in the middle of this godforsaken landscape in the middle of the winter here in northern Vermont. I don't know how you people live here. I came here in January. Oh, my God. To give a talk at a conference. But anyway, so we wanted to know if the changing resources, you know, when there's rain, there's flowers, there's bees, there's honey. When it's not raining and it's a dry season, the water holes dry up and the animals become more predictable. And that means the Hadza can ambush hunt. So consequently, during the dry season, they eat more meat. In the wet season, they eat more sugar. They eat tubers throughout the year. They eat baobab throughout the year. And meaning they eat fiber no matter what else they're eating constantly. So we do see an ebb and flow in some resources. And lo and behold, that's what we found. So we published these results in Science last year. We made the cover. Very exciting. Next, please. So again, I'm going to skip this particular paper, and we're going to move on to something else. But I just want to show you that we see there's something that's pretty interesting is that when you look at the total species of bacteria in the Hadza gut, it seems to dip in the wet season. Okay, we didn't expect this. We expected the microbiome to change. We didn't expect the overall diversity to drop. Total numbers of species, which are called O2, operational taxonomic units. So we do see seasonal cycling. And when you look at the industrialized microbiota, all of us in here, it doesn't change much. Again, this is an exaggerated graph, but basically the diversity dips. And it changes from season to season. Next, please. And then the composition changes as well. I apologize for this little figure. My computer blew up yesterday. I got a brand new computer yesterday in Chicago, and I put my talk together this morning. So I threw this in there. But this is just real simply, on this side of the graph, these are industrialized populations, people from Japan, the UK, Ireland, the United States. And on the left-hand side, we have Burkina Faso in West Africa. We have the Hadza. We have individuals from Malawi. So you clearly see, just based on the color, westernized population. Now each one of these dots represents an individual and their total composition of bacteria. So the closer the dots are together, the more similar their gut microbiome. So all of us in this room would end up over on this side, relatively close to one another, kind of scattered throughout. And then people in rural settings and hunter-gatherer settings look very different. The one thing I want you to focus on here, two things I want you to focus on, is this particular bump right here is a group of bacteria called Akkermansia. Now, Akkermansia, remember that slide I showed you when we started? That mucin layer, or mucus as we say in West Texas, is that mucin layer is a place that Akkermansia likes to hang out and eat. So if you starve your bacteria, bacteria eat dietary fiber. Humans do not possess the ability to break down dietary fiber. It passes to the colon where it's fermented. So we've set up a moist, nutrient-rich place for these bacteria to live, and they break down dietary fiber for us, ferment it, and then they produce gases, which we all know. They also produce things like acetate, butyrate, propionate that are used by the human body. So if you don't feed your bacteria, now they also eat other undigested things as well, but if you don't feed your bacteria, they eat that mucin layer, okay? And then they expose the lining of the intestinal wall. So in Western populations, we see lots of mucin degraders. Over in Hadza land and other rural settings, you don't see mucin degraders. They do have Akkermansia, but not very many of them. And the one thing that they have a lot of is they have a lot of a group of bacteria called Prevotella. Everybody in this room carries at least 2 species, probably no more, of a group of bacteria called Prevotella. The Hadza have 13 to 20, okay? Hadza have lots of Prevotella. We don't have that much. The Hadza have very little Akkermansia, mucin degradation. We have lots of Akkermansia in this crowd. Next, please. So again, I apologize for the hard-to-see graphs, but basically what I wanted to point out here is Prevotella. Remember that group of bacteria that we have a lot of in the West? The Hadza have, that we have a lot of in Hadza land. It also seems to change throughout the season. So that seasonal cycling, what happens is this. The Hadza have a certain package of bacteria in January, and as they move into the summer, they lose entire groups of bacteria. They drop below detection levels, and they come back up at the end of the year. Just so happens those bacteria that they lose seasonally, year after year, are the ones that are missing from our Western gut. They lose them too, but they reacquire them later in the year. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So anyway, Prevotella seems to change throughout season in Hadza land between wet and dry. Prevotella abundance, you'll see the USA, we have very little to no Prevotella. The group of people that do have a lot of Prevotella in the United States are vegans. And so we learned that from the American Gut Project. But you see in Malawi, Tanzania is in yellow, and Venezuela, there's high levels of Prevotella. Again, they carry a dozen or more species of Prevotella that we have lost. So the question is that important? Next, please. Okay, so one of the things that's, after you spend a couple of years hanging out in Hadza land, is when I first went there, I wasn't prepared. I grew up in Central Texas, bow hunting and dressing out deer and fishing, so I was surrounded by death, if you will, and blood and urine and feces of animals on the landscape. Now, a lot of people have moved away from that, but one of the things that I wasn't prepared for was the extraordinary connection the Hadza have with the microbes of the animals on the landscape. This guy in the middle here, that's the stomach contents from a zebra. So what happens when you butcher an animal, your hands get bloody, and that stuff's very sticky. So what they do is they run their hands in the stomach contents, which is acidic, to clean off the blood. And then they really don't clean that off. Now that's full of microbes. And then they go back to camp and they transfer it to their relatives and to their children and so on and so forth. The other thing that the Hadza do, which I wasn't prepared for, and I should have known this, and I wrote about this in Nature a few years ago, is I saw a Hadza man kill a, I can't remember which ungulate it was. It wasn't a dick. It was an impala. He killed an impala, and I sat and watched him. I photographed him. I sampled him while he was field dressing it. He took the stomach contents out. He hung it in a tree. He sliced it open. He got all the vegetable matter out. Then he just started eating the stomach sushi style. Okay, not a big deal. But then he took the colon out of the impala. He took the pellets and just kind of ran them out like that. They went on the ground like Skittles. And then he chopped up the colon and ate it raw. Now, I was not prepared for that. I wrote about this in Nature, and half the people didn't believe it was real unless I showed them photographs. And so at that moment in time, I just was literally sat back and just said, I get it now. And we're going to talk about what I get in a minute. And so that movement of microbes from one species to the next has been going on for millions of years, and we've cut that link. Skin, blood, urine, colon, stomach, on and on and on. Now, that photograph on the right, that little girl bit the head off that bird after I took that photograph. So, again, we sample the head of the bird, we sample the mouth of the bird, we sample the feces of the bird. So she consumes the microbes on the skin and in the mouth of that bird, and then she rips the bird open and then eats the entire thing literally by herself. And I have photographs of her taking the whole thing down. So again, the extraordinary exchange of microbes between species on the landscape has been going on for millions and millions of years. Next, please. So again, this is all these are hands. So when we sample them, we sample their hands left and right. By the way, the Hadza wipe their ass with their hand. 95% of them are right-handed, and they clean it in the dirt, kind of. All right. So there's lots of feces everywhere in Hadza land, and we have every reason to believe that's been going on for a very, very, very long time. This is actually kind of interesting. Each one of these gray dots represents the skin or hand sample of a Hadza. So they all have this, again, closer the dot, the more similar the individuals are to one another. But what happens is that top dot under activity, it says 1 hour after butchering an impala. So this dot down here, so I sampled this guy before he went hunting. He killed an impala, and then after he was finished, I sampled his hand again, and now his hand looks very different than everybody back in the camp. So he goes back into the camp, and he moves those impala microbes around. The next dot, after 30 minutes of butchering a kudu is a huge ungulate. So again, that's over here. So every time they touch an animal, their skin microbiome changes, okay? Well, we kind of all get that, but they then move those microbes back into the camp. Now, after a couple of 6 to 12 hours, their hand shifts back, and it looks like the rest of everybody. The point being is that they take on the microbiome of the landscape as they move around that landscape, okay? The only thing that doesn't really, so you have things like after butchering a kudu, hunt day, and then after harvesting honey, it doesn't really change their microbiome. After harvesting berries, doesn't really change their hand microbiome that much. Next. So the way to think about it is like this. Now, this didn't make a lot of sense to me when I went there because we were just interested in seasonality and so on and so forth. But after spending a couple of years there, you kind of take a 30,000-foot view of this. You go, holy shit, pun intended. If you think about it as a road map, okay, the Hadza sit at the crossroads of a microbial superhighway, all right? So imagine these little lines, these little highways, the gray ones. You guys have all looked at an atlas because now Google Maps doesn't let us look at it anymore. But remember those old atlases? You pop them open, and you have all the little gray roads, which were the county roads, and then you had the state roads, and then you had the highways, those big red ones, and then you had these little nodes. The nodes, in this particular case, from the great state of Texas, is Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, to a lesser extent, Austin and El Paso. So imagine a Hadza standing at those crossroads as they hunt and gather on the landscape. Literally, those microbes pass through their gut and on their skin, this microbial superhighway. We've removed ourselves from that microbial superhighway. So this is how humans have evolved for millions of years, and importantly, this is how our immune system evolved, and also in non-human primates as well. We have a big project where we study chimpanzees as well, which contributes to our understanding of the Hadza. So again, for me, it's like looking at a map. And if you can imagine a Hadza standing out in a field and all these animals floating around them, they're all one. They are all one. And we've disconnected from that symbiotic relationship with the landscape, plants and animals, and the water that contains those microbes as well on the landscape. Next. So again, water. Here's another non-fresh water source. Baboon shit, bird shit, sometimes human poo. The Hadza will also they'll pick baobab seeds out of baboon shit and eat them. I've done it too, but not until, it was fairly dry, but I've done it too as well. Didn't get sick. But anyway, these water sources are where animals aggregate. Birds land there, they piss, they poo. Everybody aggregates around these water sources. So do the Hadza. So these water sources are like the Houston, Dallas, El Paso, Austin. There are nodes of concentrations of microbes, and this is one of them. A kill site is a node. Harvesting honey is a node. But moving from the kill site to the camp to another camp is one of those little county roads, okay? One of those little gray ones. So there's superhighways, county roads, dirt roads, but it is a microbial superhighway nonetheless. Next. So, if we think about the African savanna, and if you believe in evolution and you believe humans evolved in East Africa or maybe even Southern Africa, whatever it may be, humans shared water sources and resources with every animal on the landscape. So when I say slipping from the pond, I'm saying we've slipped from this pond. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, get in here in a minute. Again, I'm going to try to hustle. I've got about 20 minutes. I'm lying. It's going to take 40 minutes. But anyway. If you can imagine, if anybody's ever been to the Serengeti or Ngorongoro Crater or been to Southern Africa or been to any of these parks and sat around these water holes, it's absolutely extraordinary. So we have a project we're trying to put together on the Serengeti where we're going to start looking at exchange of microbes between the animals and at these water holes. Again, major source of, call it probiotics if you will, okay? Probably would make most of in this room sick if we dipped off in there and took a drink. But anyway, this is our reality for millions of years, this microbial superhighway and the landscape we shared with everybody else. Next. So we're going to move on to the talk. Sexual division of labor. So Hadza are what are called central-based foraging society. So in other words, you have a camp, okay, and in the morning the men go that way, in the morning the women go that way. They theoretically bring resources back, okay, and provision the other people that stayed in camp. Or if the men come back empty-handed, by the way, the women provide the vast majority of the calories, and the vast majority of calories in Hadza land come from plants, all right? Big hunter-gatherers, but you're not always successful. And so you have sexual division of labor. Men hunt and gather honey. Women dig tubers and collect berries more so than men. So they have different diets. And so you can watch this. There's anthropologists who have been working with these guys for decades. This sexual division of labor means that men typically eat more meat and they eat more honey. Women typically eat more tubers and eat more berries. A lot of men that take down birds will often eat them in the field, especially young boys. By the time the boys are, I'm going to screw this up, but somewhere between 6 and 10 years of age, they're getting the vast majority of the calories on their own. Can you imagine our 10-year-olds getting the vast majority of their calories on their own? They can't even do anything on their own. And so one of the things that was interesting to us was this sexual division of labor. So they have basically different macronutrient intakes. And by looking at populations in the United States, we know that people that eat a lot of carbohydrates or people that eat a lot of sugar and fat, they look a little different. Their microbiome, those dots are farther apart on that pico egg plot, okay? So they're different. So diet drives or modulates and shapes your microbiome, okay? Next. It doesn't in Hadza land. All right? So we expected that if men and women, there was sexual division of labor. Now, here's the interesting thing. When the little girls and boys are this big, they hang out with mom, all right? And also in Hadza camp, the men have their fire, the women have their fire, and betwixt the twain, they do not meet. And so you'll have kids moving over to the guy's fire, throwing rocks at them, making the kids go back to the women's fire. But once the boys get a certain age, they get to migrate over to the other fire. But up until that point, they go out in the morning with their mothers. The boys and girls stay together until the boys are, again, I'm going to screw this up, but somewhere between 5, 6, 7 years of age, then the boys move over and they go hunting. Okay, so we expect the boys and girls have literally identical diets, and then they get to a certain point, and then they split. All right, girls go this way and hunt or forage with their mothers until they're teens, and when they get older, and then boys go this way and with hunting with the men. So we expected this division to actually split the microbiome as well. They look identical from the time they're born to when they die 80 years of age. Speaking of dying, the life expectancy of a Hadza is early 30s, all right? Has nothing to do with nutrition, has everything to do with child mortality. The Hadza, 1 out of 5 die before they're 5, malaria, simple infection, childbirth, which is the same mortality rate as chimpanzees. So if you have two 30-year-olds, 2 together make 60, 2 into 60 is 30. If they have a child that dies at childbirth, you have to now divide 3 into 60. Average life expectancy of that family is 20, okay? So life expectancy is not a measure of nutritional status or anything else to that extent. a little bit, but it's mainly has to do with other things. So again, Hadza land, men and women overlap. In the United States, men and women don't overlap. Eastern Europe, we don't overlap. There is some overlap, but there's differences. So sexual division of labor doesn't differentiate the microbiome. Diet doesn't matter that much, okay, in this particular setting. All right, next. Here's another interesting phenomenon. There was about a dozen, so red is tribe, blue is boarding school. These are kids. Okay, there was about a dozen girls that left the bush and went to a boarding school. This boarding school, I got there after they'd been there for 5 months. They live there 24/7. They live in these little dormitories. It's a rough dormitory. This is not the kind of boarding school you're going to see in and around Shelburne Farms. The girls eat the same food all day long. They eat beans, a thing called ugali, which is boiled maize, and a few other kinds of things. It's a very monotonous diet. So these girls have been pulled from their environment, not pulled, they left their environment, they now live in a boarding school, they eat this horrible, monotonous food day after day. Of course, they love it because they're around kids all day, but they're not eating kudu, they're not eating impala, they're not eating zebra, giraffe, lion, warthog. They'll pick the occasional berry in the trees around here. So we expected, these girls have been there for 5 months, that their microbiome would be totally different because they had a totally different diet. The blue dots are the girls in the school. The red dots are gender and age-matched cohorts in the field, okay? For all intents and purposes, they overlap, which we did not see that coming. We expected them to look totally different, totally different. So again, sexual division of labor, different resources, everybody looks the same. Go to a boarding school, eat some funk for 5 months, live in a dormitory, access to well water, by the way, not a pond, they're drinking well water, doesn't affect their microbiome significantly. You see some separation, but it's not that significant. Next. Another thing that was interesting, I stole this from a colleague, but you guys remember a couple years ago when it first came out, it said that, you know, that if you had so many of these bacteria and less of these, you were probably going to be obese. Researchers can say they can predict whether somebody's obese or lean just by looking at their microbes, okay? And that was elevated levels of firmicutes, which is a particular phylum of bacteria. So in other words, obese people have a elevated level of firmicutes relative to another group of bacteria called Bacteroides, whereas lean people have, it's a little bit more similar. So I don't have a slide for this because I lost my computer yesterday, in Hadza land, we have some big women. Now, the average BMI of a Hadza is around 20 to 22. I'm not 21 or 22. Maybe Alec Webb in the back's 21 or 22. There's some 21, 20. So very, very thin, very muscular. But you have some morbidly obese Hadza women, basically, and there's a few men. Our sample size is small, but we have some obese Hadza women. We thought, well, we sampled them. They're going to look totally different than their lean cohorts in the field. Now, these are women who kind of left the bush. They moved to town, built a mud hut. They sell Coke, Fanta, other delicious stuff, maize, things like that, have easier access to antibiotics and so on and so forth. When we sampled them, we can't tell the difference between them and their very lean cohorts in the field. So very different than in the West. Very, very different than we see in the West. And I remember when I told you when we first started talking, there's some Hadza, you can right now book a safari to Tanzania and see the Hadza, all right? You'll go out in your Land Cruiser, you'll pull into one of these camps that's close to the Serengeti or Ngorongoro crater. Now, I'm in camp sometimes with the Hadza when the tourists are pulling up. You can see the tourist truck from 10 miles away. The Hadza run in, put on the baboon skins, you know, get the bow out, and then they run out, and then they take the tourist hunting, and then the tour company has to pay them. It's like, I think it's $6 or something like that. That's a shit ton, pun intended, money. And so now they have a cash economy. So when that tourist vehicle leaves, they hightail it to town to get liquor, cigarettes, booze, on and on and on. So Hadza that have access to money that are almost fully acculturated with regards to access to certain foods, when we look at their microbiome, we thought, well, these guys are going to look totally different. Antibiotics, cigarettes, crappy booze, easy access to maize. They still hunt and gather, but they don't hunt and gather as much. The contribution of hunted and gathered resources is much less. They still live in grass huts, but again, spend a lot of time in town with other folks. We look at their microbiome, can't tell them apart from their buddies living 50 kilometers out in the bush that hunt and gather full time, that don't eat, that have lower access to antibiotics, that don't eat as much maize and don't drink as much booze. So again, they look the same, and this culture, what we call an acculturation gradient or westernization, does not change their microbiome significantly. Next. I apologize, this is a crappy slide. This is in a paper that we did with comparing it to Himalayan populations, but I just want to point out that if you're in a Hadza camp and you get your water from a stream or a spring, and we compare it to another Hadza camp that's, let's say, way over there, and they get it from a different stream, okay? Now, Hadza land, there are cows, okay? There's a pastoralist Toga there. They shit in the water sources and so on and so forth. But one of the interesting findings we found is that if you look at yellow and green, based on your water source, you look a little different. So the water is shaping the microbiome because of the bugs in the water to a little extent, which is kind of interesting. But again, apologize for the hard to see graph. Next, please. All right. So an emerging research theme in the West is this. There seems to be something going on with diversity. So what happens if you start off with 1,000 species of bacteria and those bacteria drop off? If you take a broad spectrum antibiotic, 1,000 milligrams of amoxa this or amoxa that, you're going to not only kill the bad bacteria, but you're also going to kill the good bacteria. You're going to drop the diversity of species in your inner ecosystem. So Ecology 101 teaches us that less diverse ecosystems are more susceptible to change by, let's say, a perturbation. An example would be, let's say you have a grassland and you got 15 species of grass growing, and then over here you have a grassland with only one species growing, and here comes the drought, okay? If you have 15 species of grass, maybe half of them are drought resistant, and you're rolling the dice on this one over here. So more diverse ecosystems, aquatic or terrestrial, doesn't matter where you look in the world, more diverse ecosystems are more resistant and more resilient. Resistant meaning they're resistant to change, and resilience is how fast they recover and bounce back. So remember these terms. Resilience is how fast you bounce back. Resistance is how much you're susceptible to change in the first place. All right? So there's this emerging theme, and there's huge projects underway right now all over the world where you see a drop in diversity in a population. Well, I'll give you an example. There's a huge autism project going on right now, and they're following huge groups of kids before they get sick. And so they follow these kids, and they sample them pretty frequently, their stool samples, and all of a sudden one kid attracts an autoimmune disease, becomes autistic, whatever. They see a drop in the diversity of the microbiome before the disease. So the question is always, did the disease cause the drop in diversity, or was it preceded by a drop in diversity? It's the cause and correlation stuff. So, but this emerging theme, just like in ecosystems and prairie management and wildlife management, more diverse ecosystems are more resistant and more resilient. So what happens is the Hadza have about nearly twice the diversity of bacteria in their guts than anybody in this room. They have one of the most diverse set of gut microbiomes anywhere in the world, including the uncontacted Yanomamo. And so the Yanomamo have a large diversity, but not as diverse as the Hadza. Whereas in the West, we have a depleted or a degraded ecosystem and less diversity. Okay, next. All right, so what's going on between us and them? Why does everybody in this room have a less diverse microbiome? And that less diverse microbiome, and I think this is the crystal ball and the writing on the wall, is playing a causal role in an extraordinary number of diseases. Everybody's looking for the magic bug or the magic bullet, but this drop in diversity seems to be a kind of an overarching causal theme in most research projects now. So what happens in Hadza land, this is on the green on the left, this is industrialized populations. So if you go to downtown London or whatever, go to the Piccadilly or go to whatever, go down to Bernie Sanders' place down here, wherever, there's not a lot of wildlife. There's the occasional cat, scraggly dog, a mouse, a few birds, and some vegetation. You go to Hadza land, or you go to the landscape where our immune system evolved over millions of years, it's extraordinary diversity of animals and plants and birds and on and on and on and on. So this is the regional species pool. So a regional species pool is all of the plants and animals and invertebrates and everything else that are in a particular defined area. And so Lots of diversity in East Africa where we evolve, not so much diversity where our kids are born today. So macro, this is the macro level regional species pool. Next. Consequently, if you go down, if you have lots of diversity in macro, there's lots of diversity in micro. In this particular case, microbes. So if you've got 50 different species of mammals, 700 different species of birds, hundreds of species of plants, dirty water sources, the list goes on, you consequently have an extraordinary diversity of microbes in your regional species pool, okay? So greater diversity of macro, potentially, in this particular case, greater diversity of microbe. So then what happens is, you then look at Hadza land. So these are what are called filters, all right? So this is the water in Hadza land, this is the water in Burlington. This is the house in Hadza land, this is the house in New York. So 50% of the world's population lives in urban settings now. That number is projected to skyrocket over the next 50 years. So in other words, there's very few barriers, there's very few filters between the Hadza and our ancestors and the micro on the landscape. So these filters filter it down. So think about it like this, you know, pesticides, clean water, baby formula, nicely neat wrapped food. Most of our vegetable material in the United States that we eat, not so much around here, comes from the Salinas Valley in California. It's triple wash. The second wash is chlorine. The last one washes most of the chlorine off. So we basically scrub the microbes from our food supply, from our houses. When we swab the inside of a Hadza hut and we swab the outside of the hut, they look the same. If we swab the outside of that apartment building and then the inside, they look totally different. The inside looks like people's skin. So anyway, these are filters. They filter the microbes down. Diet is a filter, okay? Now, everybody in this room heard, you know, everybody's focused now on what should I eat to improve my microbiome, all right? We know that antibiotics have a significant impact on your gut microbes. When you take an antibiotic, it ratchets down your diversity. And then after you stop the insult or the perturbation, after you stop it, you start to recover. That's your resilience. How fast you recover depends on your access to the regional species pool, okay? How fast you recover depends on your access to the regional species pool, okay? So when you take that antibiotic, it ratchets down. You may recover in a day, a week, a month, a year, or never, all right? I've seen Hadza, some Hadza have access to antibiotics. I've watched Hadza take antibiotics. We don't give them antibiotics. I've sampled them before, during, and after. They recover immediately. Why? There's very few barriers between them and their regional species pool. They have very few filters. Now, the reason we talk so much about diet in microbiome research, we talk about diet and antibiotics. You know why? It's because we can measure it, okay? You can take a bunch of people, sequester them in a hospital, feed them macaroni and cheese and do whatever you want to them. You can screw with their microbiome. You can measure the macronutrients. You can measure the calories. You can measure it all. So consequently, we can measure the impact on the microbiome. The problem is diet is just a small part of how you shape and modulate your microbiome. We talk about it because we can measure it. We talk about antibiotics because we can measure it in milligrams, okay? When in fact, it has more to do with our regional species pool, which is very hard to measure. Now, when I first started talking, I said we sample the soil, the dirt, the plants, the animals, everything. So we've got not a complete picture, but a really good picture of the regional species pool. And we know which microbes occur in the zebra, and we know which zebra microbes occur in the Hadza. We know which warthog microbes, giraffe, this, that, berries, so on and so forth. Now, if you walked into a study in St. Louis and you're one of 100 people that they're going to take a stool sample for, it's impossible to measure your environment because you work over there, he works over there, she works down there, she eats this, he eats that. Your free living and your regional species pool is not only depleted, but very difficult to understand. So this petri dish, for the lack of a better term, which is our Hadza project, is extraordinary in that we can track microbes across the entire landscape, which has never been done before, okay? So again, what we're talking about today is this drop in diversity has everything to do with the filters. Average American spends 90% of their time in a house, a car, or an office building, all right? We all use antimicrobial soaps, most of us. We all wash and bathe too much. I live in West Texas. I bathe about once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, okay? And I don't smell that bad. okay? But some people will bathe their children twice a day. Birthing method is a filter, okay? It's a barrier. If the baby's born C-section and skips the inoculation by not passing through the vaginal canal, but is now inoculated with the skin microbiota, birthing method is a filter. Baby formula is a filter. Wet wipes is a filter. Squeaky clean grandma is a filter, all right? A baby born in Hadza land is born in the dirt, okay? Within 2 or 3 weeks, it's being drug around camp by the siblings. I got pictures of Hadza kids chewing on bloody bones. There is no barrier between the environment and the Hadza baby. Consequently, in the United States, it takes 2 to 3 years for an infant to accumulate an adult-like microbiome. In Hadza land, it takes 6 months. Okay, we think this is important with regards to how it trains the immune system, but you're also going to lose some kids, okay, to simple infections, which is not acceptable there, and of course it's not acceptable here. So when you're talking about microbial diversity, and you're talking about an inner ecosystem, and you're talking about creating a more resistant and more resilient ecosystem, you got to start talking about filters. You got to stop just talking about diet. Now, diet's critically important, and it's something that we do all day long, so we focus on it, we can control it, we can measure it, but we need to take in consideration our entire regional species pool and our access to it. Next. So what happens is, come on, tree. All right. So we have that graph with all those filters above, and so now you've filtered the microbes. Each one of these squares represents an individual. So if you don't have a lot of filters, you have greater microbial diversity. If you got a lot of filters like we do in the West, I like these foraging guys that provided lunch that I missed because I had to put my talk together. They may look like a little bit more like this. And so you have less diversity available to your gut. And also in Hadza land, or let me back up. If you go to a cul-de-sac in St. Louis and you got family A, family B, you look at the gut microbiome of family A and you compare them to the neighbors, they look totally different because they work in different places, they eat different foods. This group drinks a lot of tequila, this one doesn't, you know, whatever. So they look very different. When you go to Hadza land, you have a family in one hut, they look like the family in the next hut, and the next hut, and the next village. It doesn't matter if you're a schoolgirl, or if you're obese, or if you're a man, or if you're a woman, if everybody looks the same. So the meta community, okay, is one. So if you decide, for example, you and I are gonna go gather honey. I've watched Hadza consume 10, 15, 20,000 calories as best I can measure in one sitting. I get to 5,000 calories, I'm heaving, okay? So they'll get these perturbations, these insults, okay? Eating 10,000 calories of honey is a filter. So now what it's going to do is shape the microbiome towards sucrose and fructose and those other kinds of things. But you know what happens? Within 12 to 24 hours, it looks just like it did before they ate the honey because there's no barriers. Now, if you today go home and wolf down a gallon of Haagen-Dazs ice cream and smoke a big old blunt, your microbiome might not recover for a few days because the dispersal, the immigration of new microbes to replace the ones that may have been depressed is going to be slower or potentially non-existent. So that's why what happens when you take a broad spectrum antibiotic, you may lose microbes and never get them back, okay? Now, a Hadza takes a broad spectrum antibiotic, bounces back immediately, all right? So what happens is the community is more similar, okay? The alpha diversity is higher. So then what happens is when you are challenged with an antibiotic, so over here on the right, this good-looking guy right here, when he takes an antibiotic, it knocks the shit out of his microbiome, and he slowly recovers. And over life, it ratchets downward. There's a beautiful experiment done by the Sonnenberg lab a couple years ago. It's published in Nature, where they took generations of mice and screwed with their diet and ratcheted down the diversity that was passed off to the offspring. So as the quantity of dietary fiber, food for bacteria, decreased over each generation, it ratcheted down. So theoretically, children born, there's a beautiful little 1-month-old baby I saw here today. Theoretically, that baby, not knowing the diet of that family, will probably have a less diverse microbiome passed on that it received from its mother, okay? So over time, it ratchets down, okay? The perturbation is a greater challenge. The dip is greater. Where in Hadza land, it could be a sugar impulse, it could be a pulse of meat, it could be an antibiotic, it could be listening to reggae, whatever it is, okay? It's going to knock the microbiome, but it's going to recover very quickly, okay? And it's going to be very resistant, very resilient. Humans today in the Western world probably have the least resistant and resilient guts in human history right now. We probably also have the most alkaline colons in human history. Okay, we measure the acidity of the colonic environment through the stools. So the Hadza, believe it or not, have very acidic colonic environments. Now, you're interested in acidity if you're talking about blood and cancer and stuff. In our particular case, you want an acidic colon environment. Everybody in this room should go buy pH strips at the pharmacy, dip it in your next poo and measure it, screw with your diet, try to get your pH more acidic, okay? So when you change acidity, that means you're producing short-chain fatty acids, which also help fight off pathogens. It also serves as a food source for the colonic cells. It goes on and on and on and on. So anyway, this is what Hadza land looks like. This is what we look like as a function of our regional species pool and our filters. Next, we're getting close to the end and the punchline. All right, you go through all this, here we are. Here's Westerners on the bottom, green on the top. The lack or the drop or the degradation of our inner ecosystems, regional species pool, barriers, filters, meta-communities, closeness, perturbations, that's where we got where we are today. All right, next. All right, there it is in one graph. Next. Okay, so we know, again, I'm almost done here. So we know the problem with microbiome research now is figuring out cause versus correlation. Correlation you can't put in the bank. Causation you can, all right? There's very, very little causation, but everybody's working on it, from psychiatry to heart to autoimmune. Depending on what your specialty is, everybody's working on the microbiome in connection to its particular field of study. So we know that the microbiome is connected in some way, shape, or form to obesity, diabetes, inflammatory diseases, allergies, acne, skin cancer, preterm births, you name it. It's hard to find a problem that ails the Western world that's not connected to a group of microbes or a singular microbe, all right? So we know that drop in diversity plays a role in this. So it's not, so the question is if diversity matters, how do we reacquire it? Do we really need 20 species of Prevotella like the Hadza? Now, I'm not arguing that we should eat like the Hadza. Our project's not about diet. It's about microbiome. And diet is a component of it, but it's just one of the filters that we study, okay? And so the question is, do we need 20 species of Prevotella? Now, you guys probably know this, but, you know, bacteria can actually, there's redundancy. You can have bacteria blue, bacteria red, and they can carry out the same functions even though they're different colors. So the composition, there's overlap and redundancy. So the system has redundancy, but have we dropped it to the point where redundancy is not keeping up? Okay, next. All right, so here's what's happening. So if you talk to an ecologist, this is how they put this in perspective. So what happens is, again, remember that concept of resistance and resilience, okay? So the more diversity you have in a gut microbiome, the more resistant it is. So think about that as a deep dip, and there's a basketball at the bottom. So the more diversity, the deeper that hole gets, and harder it is to move that ball, all right? Very hard to move that ball out of that dip, okay? So it's what we call a stable state of a non-degraded ecosystem. It works in aquatic and terrestrial settings. But as diversity drops, that basin of attraction rises. That shallow, it starts to shallow, and then that ball may roll over to an alternative stable state, okay? Next. And think about it like this. So we're suggesting that people like the Hadza, who are still intimately connected to nature, more so than many populations in the world, in a place in the world where our immune system evolved, okay? That reference basin of attraction, you know, the Hadza swing in it like this. Lots of sugar one day, lots of fat one day, lots of antibiotics one day, too much reggae one day, too much Rihanna one day, whatever it is. But if for some reason their resistance, meaning their diversity dropped, it may make it over the hump, and here we are today in a different steady state, in a state where we are susceptible to diseases tied to microbes. Next. Think about it like this. What do we do now? Okay, so let's say we have a problem, a drop in diversity, and we think that diversity might play a role in our susceptibility to autoimmune disease, or heart disease, or obesity, or becoming a Republican, or whatever. So there's two ways to think about it. If you're an ecologist, you think about passive versus active restoration. So how do we restore that diversity, okay? How do we restore that diversity in a depleted regional species pool, okay? So one way is a passive. So if you have a degraded system, okay, let's just say you have cows that are trampling the crap out of a landscape, you build a fence, that landscape recovers, okay? That's passive, okay? In this particular case, you remove the insult, okay? You remove the cows. So if the insult is sugar, whatever, who knows? You know, we still don't, and nobody knows what the optimal diet is with regards to that filter. We do know that dietary fiber and polyphenols and these things promote diversity, but at the end of the day, I've probably been sampled in more than any other human being on earth outside of Rob Knight. I do all these goofy little experiments. I haven't done a lot of them lately. I'll go on a high-fat diet, measure my microbiome before, during, and after, maintain that same diet, but then introduce high levels of dietary fiber, and I'll just screw with myself, if you will, okay? And I can, just by modulating my dietary fiber intake, I can get 60–70% of my calories from fat, a little bit from protein, and a few from carbohydrates. My microbiome looks like this. I can eat that same diet, but just add fiber, it looks totally different. So it's not the presence of the fat, which gets demonized, by the way, in the press and even microbiome press. It's the absence of the fiber. Remember, the Hadza eat fiber all day long, okay? So passive would be to remove the insult. In this case, cows, could be antibiotics. You remove antibiotics or be more cautious about the antibiotics you take. It may improve diversity. If you open a window and remove the impediment from microbes blowing in from the environment, that's also passive. And then the other one is active restoration, okay? Active restoration is like a fecal transplant. You're going to go in, you're going to alter the entire ecosystem, okay? The problem with passive and active is passive will fail if key species are not present, all right? So let's just say you have a depleted or degraded ecosystem. You do passive restoration, you remove perturbations, so the diversity is supposed to go up, okay? But if you don't have access to that diversity on the landscape because your regional species pool is depleted, you're screwed. You can only go so much, okay? Now, when I lived in Hadza land, I'd be there weeks, months on end. I would live as a hunter-gatherer. I would eat their food. I would cut down on the whiskey, all that other kind of stuff, and my microbiome would go so much. And I also did a fecal transplant, and very different. That is active restoration, all right? So in a Western world, we're not going to become hunter-gatherers. We're not going to get giraffes as pets. This guy's not going to hunt warthog, all right? We're not going to drink baboon shit-laden water, all right? So passive may not be the solution, okay? Which is concerning. And I'm concerned. Sitting underneath a baobab tree, talking to these guys at 10 o'clock at night, passing the blunt around, you know, talking about hunting, talking about where we're going to go the next day. And I'm just sitting there going, how are we ever going to get here? Okay? Pharmaceutical companies are working on it. They're trying to put the regional species pool in a pill as the next generation probiotics, and they're going to figure it out, and it's going to cost you $19.95 a week. Okay? So this is a teaching moment. This is an opportunity, I believe, for humanity to get it right. After mid-1940s, when penicillin was introduced, it was magic, okay? If anybody was alive back then, Alec, and my friend over here, I met this guy on the airplane yesterday, and he came to the talk. This is awesome. He's actually a scientist at, used to be at the University of Vermont, now in Montana, and he's retired. But anyway, so, I lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Penicillin. All right. So after penicillin was introduced in the 1940s, it was magic. Doctors were magicians. All right? Because here you could solve simple infections and you could live. Life expectancy went up. Okay? So consequently, humanity turned its health over to doctors. Then in the 1970s and 80s, women mainly, who were in control of nutrition in the household and medicine for children and so on and so forth, mainly women, these alpha nutrition females said, hey, let food be thy medicine. I'm going to take back the health of my family and my children, and we're going to be proactive about solving things. But here we go again. All right? So there was 7 companies that went public last year that are working on a magic pill. Most of them are like for fecal transplant, for Clostridium difficile. Some are trying to develop fecal transplant pills for IBS and obesity. But everybody's working on large groups of people, next generation probiotics that are putting the regional species pool, but nobody knows what that regional species pool should be, in a pill, all right? So here we go again. Here we go again. Within the next decade, I predict, somebody write this down, that there's going to be a next generation probiotic, like you guys all remember lactobacillus or acidophilus. Everybody took it. I think it's coming in the form of a cocktail, and we're all going to take it and forget our bad behavior. We're all going to take it and forget to open the window. We're all going to take it, and next time that the city says, hey, we're going to take this 300 acres of this huge diversity of plants, 10 different species of trees, grasses, invertebrates, mammals that live there, we're going to put in a parking lot, okay? I think somebody wrote a song about this. We're going to put in a parking lot, all right? And that diversity is going to disappear. When we're watching the evening news, or like people do in Vermont who read The Economist, and you see these horrific photographs of deforestation, if you actually make the connection that your gut health, your inner ecosystem is tied to your regional species pool and the filters and how you manage them. We got to move beyond antibiotics and diet in our discussion. We have to talk about nature. We have to talk about diversity. So if you can get yourself tested, join the American Gut Project, join the British Gut Project, join some damn project. If you can afford it, get your microbiome tested, look at the list, oh my God, do some research. What happens is microbiome research, I think, is the greatest gift to the environmental movement, and nobody knows it yet. Because if everybody in this, and within the next 5 years, microbiome testing will become common and it'll be paid for by insurance companies as a diagnostic tool. So once you make that leap, a certain percentage of us are going to become microecologists. And once you understand that your environment completely determines, to a great extent, not completely, but to a great extent, your gut health, which impacts your longevity and your pocketbook, and on and on and on and on. Once you make that connection with your microbiome, you then look out the window and go, oh, maybe now I'm interested in regional environmental issues. Then you can scale that to the continent, and then you can scale it to the planet. Next, please. Restoration project, next. It works. Next. All right, if we can make that connection, save the gut, save the goddamn planet. If we can make that connection, so this is what we're working on in Africa. We're not trying to figure out whether you should eat bananas over Cheerios, or Cheerios over salmon, or whatever else they sell up at this fancy restaurant. What I want to do is I want to motivate the planet to talk about deforestation. So when you see that polar bear floating on that iceberg, drinking that Coca-Cola or whatever the hell he's doing in that commercial, okay? It's so far out there. You look out the window, you go, it looks great here, all right? It's not great out here, all right? So in the 1970s, they do these surveys where they call 1,000 people sitting at home on the landline and go, how many of you give a crap about the environment? X amount say I do, X amount say I don't. That number hasn't really changed since the 1970s. So we need to move the needle on deforestation and global warming and the climate, whatever you want to call it, whatever you're interested in. We are all, the vast majority of us, are what I call check bulb environmentalists, or checkbook environmentalists, or squiggly light bulb environmentalists. We buy the squiggly light bulb and we call it a day. We write the check at the farmer's market, we call it a day. But if I can connect your gut health and the pocketbook of your family and your healthy years to the environment, now we got a chance. So I think that's going to be the greatest contribution from our project in Africa, besides my good tan. And that's it. That's all I got.